When I inherited my family's 400-acre farm, I knew it wasn't just land. It was a legacy. For 3 generations, we'd worked this soil, nurturing crops and preserving our roots. But one day, bulldozers tore through my fields, claiming it all for a subdivision. This is the story of how I fought to reclaim my land and my family's honor. The early morning sun painted the Kansas sky in soft hues of orange and pink as I drove down the winding dirt road toward my farm, my family's farm. 400 acres of fertile soil stretching out to the horizon had been ours for 3 generations. It wasn't just land to me, it was a living, breathing testament to my family's grit and determination. My grandfather had worked this soil with a horse and plow. My father modernized it with irrigation systems and combines. Now, it was my turn to carry the torch. The fields were alive with the vibrant green of soybeans and the golden sheen of corn stalks swaying in the breeze. Rows of crops stretched endlessly toward the horizon, each one a promise of the harvest to come. The farm wasn't just my livelihood, it was my pride. Every tree lining the dirt path, every patch of wildflowers at the edge of the fields, and every breath of crisp morning air told a story. My family's story. The house, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a porch that groaned under the weight of time, stood like a sentinel in the middle of it all. The old oak tree out front, its massive branches reaching toward the sky, was planted by my mother when she was just a girl. Its roots ran deep, much like our ties to this place. That week, I had left the farm in the capable hands of my 2 trusted workers, Mark and Sam, while I attended a sustainable farming conference in Wichita. Leaving was never easy, especially during harvest season. I had walked through the fields before leaving, checking every irrigation line and every stalk, making sure nothing was out of place. Mark and Sam knew the routines well, but my father had always told me, "The land feels your presence, Tom. It knows when you're gone." I laughed it off as a kid, but now, every time I left, I felt it too. The conference had been worth the trip, insightful talks on soil conservation and advancements in irrigation technology. But as much as I tried to focus, I found my thoughts drifting back to the farm. I couldn't wait to return, to smell the earth and feel the sun-warmed soil beneath my boots. There was something about standing among those rows of crops, watching them thrive under my care, that nothing else in the world could replace. As I crested the hill that overlooked my property, a sense of peace washed over me, as it always did. The land stretched out before me, golden and green in the early light. This was my sanctuary, my anchor, and though I didn't know it yet, everything I held dear was about to be tested in ways I could never have imagined. As I crested the familiar hill leading to my farm, I expected the same tranquil view that had greeted me countless times before. Rolling fields of green and gold, the soft hum of insects, the steady rhythm of life. But what I saw instead jolted me so violently that I nearly swerved off the dirt road. The air was thick with dust, swirling in chaotic clouds that obscured the horizon. The low growl of heavy machinery thundered through the still morning, shattering the peace. My heart thumped as I drove closer. At first, I thought maybe Mark and Sam had brought in some new equipment or contractors for a last-minute repair. But this was far beyond that. Massive bulldozers tore through my fields, uprooting rows of corn and soybeans as if they were nothing more than weeds. Flattened stalks stretched across the ground in sickening heaps, their golden hues dulled by the churned-up dirt. I slammed my truck to a halt at the edge of the destruction, jumping out so fast my boots skidded on the gravel. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" The roar of the machinery drowned me out, but my wild gestures caught the attention of a man standing nearby. Clipboard in hand, he wore an orange vest and the expression of someone who had no time for interruptions. He strolled over, his face pinched with annoyance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone implying he couldn't care less. "This is my land," I yelled, pointing at the destruction. "You're tearing up my fields. Who gave you permission to be here?" The man frowned and glanced down at his clipboard, flipping a few pages as if I were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "We were contracted by the Fairview Homeowners Association," he said flatly. "This area is being prepped for development, subdivision coming through." "Homeowners Association?" I stared at him, incredulous. "I'm not part of any damn HOA. This is private farmland, and you have no right to be here." He shrugged, his indifference pouring gasoline on my rising anger. "Not my problem, buddy. We're just following orders. If there's an issue, take it up with the HO." My fists clenched as I stormed toward one of the bulldozers. Its operator hesitated, eyeing me through the glass before killing the engine at my signal. The sudden silence was deafening. I turned back to the man with the clipboard, my voice trembling with fury. "You're trespassing. Get your crew off my land now, or I'm calling the sheriff." He sighed, his irritation palpable, but before he could respond, I was already dialing. My hands shook as I gave the dispatcher my address, explaining the situation in clipped, angry bursts. They promised to send someone right away. While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the destruction. Every step sank heavily into the churned soil. Every glance revealed more devastation. My crops, months of work, my livelihood, reduced to piles of broken stalks and compacted earth. The old oak tree, a sentinel of my family's history, now had several deep gashes in its bark from careless machinery. A sick feeling settled in my stomach as the full weight of what was happening began to sink in. When the sheriff, Marcus Clayton, arrived, his cruiser kicking up more dust, I rushed to meet him. "Marcus," I said, my voice a mix of relief and rage. "They're destroying my land." Marcus surveyed the scene with a grim expression. "Who authorized this?" he asked, turning to the clipboard man, whose confidence seemed to falter in the presence of a badge. "The HOA," the man muttered, flipping through his papers. "They said this area was under their jurisdiction." Marcus frowned and took the document he offered. After a few moments of reading, he shook his head. "This isn't valid. Tom's property isn't part of any HOA. Shut it down." The machines began to rumble to a stop one by one, their operators retreating under Marcus's orders, but the damage had already been done. As the contractors packed up and left, I stood among the wreckage of my fields, anger and disbelief swirling in equal measure. My sanctuary had been violated, and I wasn't about to let it go unanswered. The next morning, I woke up early, my head pounding from the restless night before. I'd barely slept, my mind stuck in an endless loop of the destruction I'd witnessed. The sight of those bulldozers tearing through my fields was seared into my memory. It wasn't just about the crops. They could be replanted, given time, but the principle of it, my land, my family's legacy, had been invaded and torn apart as though it meant nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, the deed to my property spread out in front of me, alongside survey maps and every scrap of legal documentation I could find. The yellowed papers bore my grandfather's signature, proof that this land had been legally and firmly in our family's hands for decades. No HOA had any claim to it, and I intended to prove it. Fueled by too much coffee and a simmering rage, I drove into town to the headquarters of the Fairview Homeowners Association. Their office was in stark contrast to my farmhouse, a sleek, modern building with white walls and cold, polished floors. It screamed corporate efficiency, a stark reminder of the faceless bureaucracy that had declared war on my land. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and an overly cheerful demeanor, greeted me with a practiced smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," I said, my voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "The president, preferably." Her smile faltered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't," I snapped. "But I've got a serious problem with this organization, and I'm not leaving until I get some answers." After a few tense moments of hushed phone calls, I was ushered into a small conference room. A few minutes later, Karen Blaine, the HOA president, walked in. She was everything I expected, mid-40s, dressed in a tailored suit, her sharp features framed by a perfectly styled bob. Confidence radiated from her as she extended a hand I didn't take. "Mr. Reed," she said briskly, sitting across from me, "I understand you have concerns about the recent development project." "Concerns," I said, leaning forward. "Your contractors destroyed my fields yesterday, land that doesn't belong to your HOA. What I want are answers." Karen didn't flinch, her demeanor cool and composed. "I assure you, everything was done within our jurisdiction. The property was rezoned under county approval months ago. Notices were sent to all affected property owners." I slammed the deed onto the table. "This deed says otherwise. My land is private property, and I've never been part of your HOA. I didn't get any notice, and even if I had, you don't have the right to bulldoze my farm." Karen barely glanced at the papers, her expression unchanged. "I'm sorry for any misunderstanding, but the records indicate the rezoning was legitimate. If you didn't receive the notice, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the facts." Her indifference was infuriating. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said, my voice rising. "This is theft. and I'm going to prove it. Karen folded her hands on the table, her calm demeanor infuriating. If you feel there's been an error, I suggest you take it up with the County Planning Commission. As far as we're concerned, everything was handled appropriately. I left the meeting fuming, her dismissiveness fueling my determination. In the parking lot, I called my lawyer, Nate Miller, a sharp legal mind and an old friend who'd handled land disputes before. He listened patiently as I explained what had happened. "This sounds shady, Tom," he said finally. "If they rezoned your land without your knowledge or consent, we've got a strong case. I'll start digging into the county records and see what I can find." "Thanks, Nate," I said, the weight of my frustration easing slightly. "I need this resolved fast. They've already done enough damage." "We'll get to the bottom of this," he promised. "In the meantime, start documenting everything. Photos, videos, receipts for any repairs. The more evidence we have, the stronger our case." With Nate on my side, I felt a glimmer of hope. But the road ahead was already shaping up to be long and grueling. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for my family's legacy. The deeper Nate and I dug, the worse the situation seemed. Within a few days, Nate called with his first findings. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "Tom, I've been reviewing the county zoning records. Your property was indeed rezoned 6 months ago, supposedly to accommodate a community expansion. But here's the kicker. There's no record of your signature or any acknowledgement from you." "Of course there isn't," I snapped. "I never signed anything." "That's where it gets murkier," he continued. "They submitted what appears to be a signed consent form with your name on it. Tom, it's a forgery." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Forgery. Someone had dared to fake my signature to steal my land. My anger deepened, morphing into something colder and more determined. "We need to prove it, Nate," I said. Every last detail. That evening, I walked the wrecked fields, taking photos and videos of the damage. Rows of corn lay flattened, irrigation pipes crushed into uselessness. The soil, once so carefully cultivated, was packed down and scarred with deep grooves from the machinery. My boots sank into the churned earth with every step, a physical reminder of what had been lost. I stood at the edge of the field where the old oak tree had taken the brunt of the destruction. Its bark was torn, and one of its massive limbs hung precariously, ready to fall. This wasn't just about money. This was my family's legacy under attack. The next day, Nate and I sat in his cramped office, poring over more documents he'd uncovered. Among them were internal emails from the HOA that revealed their true intentions. In one exchange, Karen Blaine had written to her legal team, "Reed's property is underutilized. Rezoning it will add significant value to the HOA. He's unlikely to put up much of a fight." My fists clenched as I read her words. "She thinks I'm just going to roll over," I muttered. "She doesn't know me." Nate nodded. "This isn't just negligence, Tom. This looks like deliberate fraud. They knew your land was valuable, and they thought they could take it without consequences." As if to make things worse, the HOA filed a counterclaim against me that same week. The document accused me of neglecting my land, citing vague complaints about overgrown weeds and unsafe conditions from machinery left on site. They even included photos of my grandfather's old tractor sitting in the barn, claiming it was a hazard. "They're trying to paint you as irresponsible," Nate explained. "It's a common tactic, make you look like the bad guy to deflect blame." I scoffed, shaking my head. They've never even stepped foot on this land, and now they're experts? But this wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a calculated move to wear me down, to make the fight as exhausting and expensive as possible. Every step forward felt like walking through quicksand, but I wasn't about to give up. Over the following weeks, the battle intensified. Nate subpoenaed more records, uncovering the HOA's meeting minutes and financial statements. The deeper we went, the more we uncovered. Their entire operation seemed riddled with questionable practices. The breaking point came when Nate handed me a copy of the forged consent form. The signature was a crude imitation of mine, close enough to fool someone at a glance, but glaringly fake under scrutiny. "This," Nate said, tapping the paper, "is our smoking gun." As I stared at the forgery, my resolve hardened. They thought they could bulldoze over me, both literally and figuratively, but they had underestimated just how much this land meant to me. This fight wasn't just about crops or soil anymore. It was about justice, and I wasn't going to back down no matter how long it took. The tide began to turn when Nate uncovered a cache of emails during the discovery process. The documents painted a damning picture of the HOA's intentions. One email from Karen Blaine to their legal team stood out. Reed doesn't need all that land. It's underutilized, and rezoning it will boost property values across the board. He'll thank us later." Her words dripped with arrogance, as though my life's work was a mere inconvenience to her grand vision. But the real bombshell came a week later. Nate called me into his office, his tone sharp. "Tom, I've got it. The consent form they forged, and it's bad." He handed me the document, and my stomach twisted as I scanned the page. The signature was a laughable attempt to mimic mine, an unsteady scrawl that looked like it had been copied from an old receipt. Nate pointed out the inconsistencies, each one more damning than the last. "This," he said firmly, "is the proof we need." It's clear fraud. Armed with this evidence, we prepared for the HOA's next move. At the pre-trial hearing, Nate wasted no time presenting the forged document, paired with expert testimony from a handwriting analyst who confirmed it was fake. Karen, seated across the room, kept her composure, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She knew the walls were closing in. The judge wasn't impressed with the HOA's excuses. "This court takes allegations of fraud very seriously," she said, her tone icy. "I expect full cooperation during discovery, or sanctions will follow." Karen's legal team scrambled to regroup, but it was clear the momentum had shifted. The forged document, combined with the incriminating emails and testimony from other victims of the HOA's overreach, painted a picture of an organization drunk on its own power. The final blow came during Karen's deposition. Nate's questioning was relentless, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Karen's increasingly defensive answers. He walked her through every email, every document, every decision she'd signed off on. When he reached the forged consent form, Karen's mask of confidence cracked. "Ms. Blaine," Nate said, holding up the document, "can you explain how Mr. Reed's signature came to appear on this form without his knowledge or consent?" Karen hesitated, her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. I don't know," she stammered. "I trusted my team to handle the paperwork." "So, you're saying this signature, clearly not Mr. Reed's, is the result of negligence on your part?" Her lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Karen's inability to provide a coherent answer was as good as a confession. Outside the courtroom, Nate's confidence was palpable. "We've got them, Tom," he said, his voice steady. "They're going to try to settle soon. They can't afford to go to trial with what we've uncovered." He was right. Within days, the HOA's legal team approached us with a settlement offer. The sum was significant, enough to cover the damages to my farm and the lost income from the destroyed crops. But I wasn't ready to accept, not without a condition. "They need to admit fault," I told Nate firmly, publicly. "This can't just end with money." Nate nodded, understanding the weight of my demand. "It'll be a tough sell, but I'll push for it." As I left the office that day, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: hope. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Justice was within reach, and I wasn't going to stop until I had it. The settlement offer came faster than I expected, and when Nate slid the paperwork across his desk, I could see the numbers were significant. It was enough to repair the fields, replace the damaged equipment, and recover the income I'd lost. But as I read through the details, I felt no satisfaction, just a bitter taste in my mouth. "They're offering a lot, Tom," Nate said, leaning back in his chair. "This is more than fair for what they've done." "It's not just about the money," I replied, my voice firm. "I want them to own what they did, publicly." Nate gave me a thoughtful look. "That's a tall order. They'll fight tooth and nail to avoid a public admission." "Then we keep fighting," I said. "They don't just get to sweep this under the rug, not after everything." Nate nodded, and over the next few days, he worked tirelessly to renegotiate the terms. Finally, the HOA caved. Their revised offer included a formal public statement admitting fault with Karen Blaine's resignation as president. It wasn't just a win, it was vindication. The day the HOA statement was published, I stood in my fields holding a copy of the local newspaper. The headline read, "HOA admits fault in land dispute, pays farmer significant settlement." Karen's carefully worded resignation letter was printed below, her tone a far cry from the arrogance I'd faced in that conference room. The funds allowed me to restore what had been lost. I hired specialists to rehabilitate the soil, cleared the damaged irrigation systems, and even replanted the rows of crops they had destroyed. The sight of fresh seedlings breaking through the earth brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. As for the old oak tree, I refused to let it stand as a reminder of what had happened. Instead, I replaced it with a young sapling, a new beginning rooted firmly in the soil my family had fought so hard to protect. Even after the settlement and the public apology, the fight didn't feel over. As I walked the recovering fields, the scars of the destruction were still visible. Deep ruts from the bulldozers, patches of compacted soil, and a void where crops should have been flourishing. The land would heal with time, but the damage had opened my eyes to something larger than just my own ordeal. The HOA's actions weren't isolated. As news of my victory spread, neighbors and strangers alike began sharing their own stories of conflict with the HOA. Small fines, unreasonable rules, and even similar attempts at land grabs. One elderly couple described how they'd been bullied into removing a ramp that made their home accessible. A young farmer revealed that the HOA had fined him repeatedly for keeping livestock too close to residential areas, despite his farm predating their existence. I realized this wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about standing up to an organization that had used its power to intimidate and exploit. So, with the help of some of these neighbors, I founded a coalition we called the Land and Liberty Alliance. Our mission was simple: protect property owners from overreach and advocate for reforms that would prevent abuses like this in the future. Our efforts didn't go unnoticed. The County Planning Commission, under mounting public pressure, enacted stricter regulations on rezoning applications, requiring mandatory notifications and clear documentation from all affected parties. For the first time, the system began to shift in favor of the people it was supposed to protect. Meanwhile, the HOA was crumbling. Investigations uncovered patterns of misconduct under Karen Blaine's leadership, and lawsuits began piling up from other homeowners emboldened by my success. Their reputation was in tatters, and their influence waned. As I watched the first green shoots return to my fields, I felt a deep sense of purpose. What started as a fight for my farm had become something bigger, a fight for fairness, justice, and the right of every person to protect what was theirs. Months later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, I sat on my porch, watching the fields that had once been barren, now filled with young, thriving crops. The land was healing, and so was I. The sapling I'd planted to replace the damaged oak swayed gently in the breeze, its roots already beginning to take hold. It was a symbol of renewal, a reminder that even after destruction, life could find a way. The fight had been grueling, more draining than I could have imagined, but standing firm had paid off. The Land and Liberty Alliance was gaining momentum, and our efforts were changing the rules for good. No one else would have to face what I had alone. I thought of my grandfather and father, who had each left their mark on this farm, and of the generations to come. This land wasn't just soil and crops, it was a legacy, and now it was secure. As the stars emerged in the evening sky, I felt a rare, profound peace. The battle was over, and the land was mine again, always and forever.